Okay, we have solved the world's problems, at least the one that was closest to us. So that's great. How's everyone doing today?
Good.
I'm glad my family's good. Who else is doing anything? Landon, how are you doing? You're doing good? That's good.
I got another part of my costume.
Oh, you're working on your costume already. That's fun.
I got the last part.
The last part. So are you all done then? Cool. And how about Anthony and Chloe? How are you guys?
Good.
You're good? You're good too? Awesome. And how about over here? Mila and friends. These are cousins.
Allison's your cousin and then Raina's your friend.
Well, friends and cousins, we're both welcome. Welcome. Good to have you guys. Anna. And way back so that you don't have to see my face is the Nelsons. I know what you're doing. I got it. All right. Well, we are going to get going for our class today. And I want to start with a question. How do we glorify God? Does anybody know how we glorify God? Even if you have a guess of what you think it would mean to glorify God. Yes, Ezekiel.
I think we can glorify him by praising him.
We can glorify him by praising him? Sure. Any other guesses on how we might glorify God? Do you guys, when I say glorify, do you even know what that means? It's okay if you don't. Okay, so Landon's shaking his head, no, and that's perfectly fine. Sometimes we use these big words, and we don't take the time to tell you what they mean. So if you hear something that's like, I don't understand that, feel free to raise your hand, too, to let me know. But to glorify is basically to give something the value that it deserves, right? So if I were to, let's say, Landon, you really like old cars, right? Okay, so you're looking at a magazine filled with old cars. And if we're thinking about old cars and how we might glorify something, we might say, you know what, this old car, we're going to set this apart and we're going to say, this car is worth respect. We're going to talk about it with the honor that it deserves, right? Because there's some cars that are really pretty special. And some cars are really not all that special, right? So I'm sure, like we were talking before, my first car, you probably wouldn't want a little model of it because it's really not that exciting. But so to glorify something is to give the value to something. So we want to do that with God because God is worth how much? Can we put a value on how much God is worth?
No.
We can't because he is so big and he is worth all of our praise. And so how we glorify him then is by doing this, by loving him. Okay, so if we're talking about the cars again, a way to glorify or to appreciate a car is to recognize its value, right? We want to do that with God, and that we show the value of God by actually loving him, okay? And then another way that we glorify God is by obeying him, because we recognize that God has the authority over us, because he's God, right? Have any of you wished that you could be God for one day? Landon, you kind of have? If you were God for one day, what would you do? It's a tough question, right? Because now all of a sudden you've got all the problems of the universe on your shoulders. And no matter what you decide, people are going to be like, you did that wrong, right? That's a tough place to be. I would not want to be God. Partially because I think I would do a really bad job. And there's no way I could even do a tiniest fraction of all the things that God does. So, we want to glorify God by loving him and obeying his commands. So, we're going to put a picture on the screen here. And I also want to talk about this, because this is going to be pretty important to our story today. And it's going to show up eventually here. We've been working on something. Poor Nick, he has to deal with all my stuff. There we go. I have this remote that I bought, and it's supposed to be super long distance, but because we're going through a wall and spiritual enemies, I don't know, it just won't work there. So we're gonna get there. But what this is, does anybody have a guess as what this is? Micah? No, it's not the Ark of the Covenant. What's that? A music box? It could be a music box. Actually, Micah, you were really close. It's not the Ark of the Covenant. We don't know where the Ark of the Covenant is. It is a representation of the Ark of the Covenant. So I just have to do that because you're Micah. All right. So this is a picture of the Ark of the Covenant. So when we talked last week about the people of Israel going into the Jordan River, do you guys remember that, for those of you who are here? And the priests brought this ark. They were carrying this into the water, and as soon as they stepped into the water, what happened? Landon?
The water started.
That's okay. You were getting there. I could tell. Yeah? It made the water pile up. And we talked about how weird that is, that water was like in a mound, because that's just not anything we see, right? So the ark is also going to be present in our story today. And I wanted to have a little bit representation so we could see what this is talking about here. Thank you. Why the Ark of the Covenant was important. So this was something very special that was a part of the tabernacle. And the tabernacle was a special tent where God's presence was with his people. Specifically, in between those angels there, that's called the mercy seat. And that's where the presence of God would be amongst his people. So if we're talking Old Testament history, it's really important because we start off, Adam and Eve are in the garden, and God is there with them, walking with them, talking with them. But then Adam and Eve sin. And now God's presence is gone. And it's gone from people directly for a long time until God starts choosing a people for himself with Abraham. And then time goes on, the people of Israel they have God, they have a sign of a covenant with God, but God's not necessarily with them in the way that they had hoped before. And so then God commands them to build this Ark of the Covenant where his presence would be with his people. And inside the box would be the 10 Commandments, a jar that would have manna in it, and manna was that bread, that like flaky dew stuff that was out that God fed his people with for 40 years, and then also Aaron's staff, which would have budded. And that's all stories that we had covered.
You were talking about words that kids might not know.
Yes.
Do they know what the covenant is?
That's a good catch. So a covenant is essentially a promise between two different people. And this was a promise that God had made with the people of Israel. Good catch, Teresa. Thank you. So this is the Ark of the Covenant, all right? And that's going to play a part in our story for today. Now we're going to go on, and before we flip the screen, who thinks they remember the first commandment? We've talked about that the last 2 weeks. Okay, someone who hasn't answered yet. We're going to shift this around. Micaiah, do you think you remember the first commandment? That is a great commandment. That wasn't one of the first of the 10 commandments. Good guess, though. Jonathan, do you know what the first commandment is?
It's right there.
No, it's not.
He's looking at it.
Oh, it's on your screen. Okay, so you can't answer. What about one of the adults? Adults can answer too. Teresa.
You shall have no other gods before me.
Right, you shall have no other gods before me. That was commandment number 1. So today we're going to say that one together. First commandment is, you shall have no other gods before me. And we're going to move on to the second commandment today. The second commandment is, you shall not use the Lord's name in vain. Okay? So what would happen if I was walking along, I was like, stub my toe, I kicked that stool really hard, and I'm like, oh, Tom Prisk! What do you think would happen? Who do you think would be like, have his ear perk up? I think Tom Prisk would, right? He'd be like, yes? So I wasn't talking to you. And he's like, well, that was my name. And I was like, oh, Tom Prisk, that was a bad movie. Or I'm so mad, I'm just Tom Prisk full of anger. And it's like, he's going like, okay, this is really confusing. Because like, you're saying my name, and I'm paying attention to you, and then you just go on ignoring me. Like, why are you doing that? Well, with God, it's kind of the same thing, except God's name is even more important than Tom Prisk. I mean, I hate to say it, but it's true. And sometimes if you pay attention, we live in a world that doesn't treat God's name very holy at all. And we hear God's name used as a curse word a lot of times. So part of God, the Trinity, is Jesus Christ. And a lot of times we hear that when people are angry, or we hear, oh my God, and they just use it so casually. And so God is saying, don't use my name in vain. And that's what vain means. It's just like meaningless, okay? So we're going to talk next week about what God is telling us to do with this commandment too. But that's command number 2. Anthony. Yes?
Is that from SpongeBob saying that, don't you dare take the name of Texas in vain?
Sure, yeah. I think that would be a good cultural connection there. Yes?
Like if people make fun of like you, like and name, you might get sad and they'll make you sorry.
Yeah, that too. Like if people are making fun of your name or making fun of you too. And like, so we just want to remember that God's name is holy and that God is holy. And so we want to give him that honor that we talked about before and glorifying God. All right. So now we're going to do an offering time. And as we're doing offering, we're going to sing a song that's going to also go with our lesson today. And I think you guys must know this pretty well. We're going to do the Lord's Army song. Okay, so stand up. We've got some actions here too. If you want to, just off the cuff. So we're going to do the Lord's Army, and it's for the first verse. The words go, I may never march in the infantry, ride in the cavalry, because that used to be on horses, and shoot the artillery. I may never fly over the enemy, but I'm in the Lord's army, yes, sir. Okay? And then we're going to do some other verses after that. So as we're singing, if you brought offering, go ahead and put it into the plate, and then hopefully by the time we're done, all the offering's in. All right? I may never march in the infantry, ride in the cavalry, shoot the artillery. I may never fly o'er the enemy, but I'm in the Lord's army. Yes, sir. I'm in the Lord's army. Yes, sir. I'm in the Lord's army. Yes, sir. I may never march in the infantry, ride in the cavalry, shoot the artillery. I may never fly o'er the enemy, but I'm in the Lord's army. Yes, sir. All right. So I'm wondering how many of you have been far enough south to end up in a country called Mexico? All right, so some of you can't sing this one, but a lot of you can. And this is the next one. It says, I may never take a trip to Mexico, ride a donkey, oh so slow, eat a cheesy taquio. So that's eat a cheesy taquio. I may never wear a big sombrero, but I'm in the Lord's army. Si, senor. All right, I think we got that one, right? Here we go. Let's see if we can throw her off with the whole speed change here. I may never take a trip to Mexico, ride a donkey, oh so slow. Eat a cheese taquio. I may never wear a big sombrero, but I'm in the Lord's army. Si, senor. I'm in the Lord's army. Si, senor. I'm in the Lord's army. Si, senor. I may never take a trip to Mexico, ride a donkey, oh so slow. Eat a cheese taquio. I may never wear a big sombrero, but I'm in the Lord's army. Si, senor. Cool. We'll be able to do that in a couple different versions throughout the year, like outer space, and we'll just keep finding more. Yes?
In my school, I have a new friend, and he was from Florida.
Oh, okay. That's pretty far south, yeah. Good job. All right. So now we're going to jump to our memory verse, Deuteronomy 31, verse 8. And so this is what it says. Again, we're going to stand up. We're going to try to do the motions together as best we can. It was, the Lord himself goes before you and will be with you and will never leave you. Where do for leave? Or forsake you. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. All right. And we're going to come to a point where there's going to be less words on there. So be ready for that, okay? Beautiful. And now, one more song. We're going to sing the books of the New Testament. All right. If you know the words, yeah, I know the words, but I mean like the key. Yeah, that's the tune I use. Is it the right key, though? That's close enough. Okay. I'm so demanding. I'm a diva leader. All right. Here we go. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Acts and the letters to the Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians and Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, 1st and 2nd Timothy, Titus and Philemon. Then comes Hebrews, then comes James, 1st and 2nd Peter, 1st John, 2nd John, 3rd John 2, Jude and Revelation. Wonderful. So again, the reason why we're doing that is then when we read passages in our Bibles, we know where to find stuff. And it's a very helpful way, like we talked about the first week, kind of like our ABCs, which can be really great. So go ahead and have a seat. We are going to get into our lesson for today. As I was talking about before, our lesson last week was all about, and if you were trying to catch it from home, I apologize. It was a messed up day for computers, and we got it fixed now. So shout out to people who might be at home. Thank you for people in the booth who are doing stuff for us. So, but we talked about how God had brought his people to the promised land, but there was one big obstacle. Remember, we had Zeke trying to get to Kaya, and he couldn't because what was in the way? The Jordan, right? And so for the people of Israel, it was the Jordan River, this big river. And do you guys remember what time of year it was?
Flood season.
It was flood season, which coincided with their harvest time. So it wasn't just a little kind of brook. It was a raging river, right? And we talked about how God had brought them through this, just like he had brought Moses and his people through the Red Sea. So today, I want to start by asking a question. I'm wondering if anybody here this morning has ever gotten sick of eating the same thing over and over and over and over and over. Okay? So, Rachel, what are you sick of eating? You forgot. I don't even want to think about it. I'm so sick of it, okay? What about you? Onions. Okay, so you eat onions a lot, but you're sick of it, or you just don't like onions. Okay, so again, we're looking for something that we've had so many times that we just can't stand anymore. Landon? Chocolate. You just made a lot of friends because they know whenever you get chocolate, they're like, hey, Landon, remember, you don't like that. I do. Anthony.
Well, I don't usually get sick. So on last Thursday, not like on last Thursday, the following week before Thursday, I have a sore throat.
Okay, had a sore throat. Micah? I missed that, Micah. What was that? Candy corn. And you had that so many times? Or you just didn't like it? Okay, so there's a difference between having something. So let's imagine that you lived in my house. And let's imagine that my wife was on a vacation for a long time. And so I'm doing all the cooking. Okay? We're going to have probably a lot of the same stuff that is really low-key, low-maintenance, like a lot of peanut butter and jelly. For some reason, like my kids can eat peanut butter and jelly until they're blue in the face. Because we use purple jelly. But I don't know. But there's something that you can just eat so much and so much that you get sick and tired of it. Well, the reason I want to bring that up is because there's a passage in our reading for today that kind of covers the same thing. And we're going to turn to Joshua chapter 5, if you brought a Bible with you. And we're going to read just two verses, verses 11 and 12. So listen to this from Joshua chapter 5, verses 11 and 12, okay? So, this is what the word of the Lord says. The day after the Passover, which was a special celebration for the people, that very day they ate some of the produce of the land. Do you guys know what produce is? It's kind of like fruits or vegetables. It's the fresh stuff at the grocery store that has its own section that doesn't come in a box. Maybe in a bag if it's saran wrap, but that's what produce is. So they ate some of the produce of the land, unleavened bread, and roasted grain. So they are able to eat the fruits and food from the land for the first time in almost 40 years. And listen what happened next. The manna stopped the day after they ate this food from the land. So if you remember in our last year, what we talked about was they were in the desert, and deserts aren't a really good place to get food. And so the people of God were complaining because that's what they did. Like, God, we wish we were back in slavery because then we had stuff to eat. We had like salt and pepper, God, and we don't have anything. And God's like, I will give you something that will come down every day except for on the Sabbath, and you can collect as much as you want and you can eat it. And you'll be nourished and it'll take care of this need. And that's what they had. But that's the only thing they had for years and years and years. So think, you're eating oatmeal every day, and that's it. You don't have anything else, just oatmeal, okay? But now we get to a part where they get into this land where God has promised them, and they're able to first eat some food from the land, and the next day God stops. Because God had taken care of them for their needs until they were able to, the land was to provide for them. And from this, what we learn is that God is our provider. And that's so important. We need to be able to live our lives trusting that God will take care and meet our needs. Okay, did you have a question or a statement, Chloe?
Every time I go with my aunt, I have oatmeal for breakfast.
Okay, are you sick of it yet, or do you still love it? You still love it? But you can imagine after like maybe 30 years, maybe, that'd be... I think 30 years might be a hard concept at this point for you, but it's still hard for me. I don't understand. All right, and now we're getting into the main part of our lesson for today, which will be in Joshua chapter 6. So if you have your Bibles, you can turn there. And I want to know, what do you guys use and rely on to protect you? So what do you have in your life that you depend on to protect you? Seatbelts. That is not one thing that I would have come up with, so thank you. Seatbelts. What's that?
Locks on your doors.
Locks in your doors, Landon? Courage to protect you, okay. We'll take two more. Anna, do you have anything that you rely on to protect you? Okay, stuffed animals, all right. And one more, Micah? The Lord, okay. I couldn't tell if it was Lord or Law, and it's like, yes, for both. All right, so I have some pictures up here of some things that we might rely on to protect us, okay? So the first one is going to be a group of people that, in our world today, in our country today, sometimes people look at these guys and girls who give their lives to serve us, and they kind of say some bad things. But let's be honest, we rely on them for our safety a lot, don't we? Because we might have laws in place, but it doesn't mean that people want to follow them. And if I were to even ask how many of you have seen some of these people work in real life when you're maybe riding in a car and all of a sudden your parents are driving and they have to stop and have a nice conversation with one of these guys for a bit? Even things like that is an example of them taking care of us, making sure our roads are safe and that people are being safe. So we rely on police officers. All right, next one. How about this? These are very important people. These are firefighters, right? Fire can be a horrible thing. And we live in a place where there's a lot of trees. So it'd be easy for a big fire to get out of control and cause a lot of damage. So we rely on firefighters to protect us and protect our homes. And that's really important too. Landon.
In 2018, wasn't there a huge fire that lasted all summer?
In 2018, are you talking about like on the West Coast or here?
Like in California.
Yeah, there's been some really large fires, and this summer has been really bad for them too. It's been fires all along the coast. So like these people are working themselves like So hard all the time. They're exhausted. So we want to be praying for them too, because that's a big job. All right, our next picture. Okay, so we get into the locked doors. And on the left here, that might not look like a doorknob because it's not. That's called a deadbolt. All right, it's something that makes it a little bit even harder to break into a house. And then the next one, money. Sometimes we depend on money to protect us. Not like if someone has trying to attack us and we're like, here, and they're like, hey, thanks, now give me the rest, right? But if we're in a difficult situation, like if there's a storm or if we have to leave, having money available can be a really big help in getting you out of that situation. So we rely on all these different things. But there was, all right, here we go. There was another thing that the people in our story were depending on, okay? And it was a big wall. And I think there's 2 pictures we have coming up here. Yes. Right here you see a picture. Now this isn't exactly like someone went back in time with the camera and like click, because we don't have that technology yet. Doctor Who's not real. But this was a representation of the city of Jericho. And as you look at this picture, what you see here is there are a couple of different walls, okay? So out on the outside here is the first thick wall, and these little things coming up the sides, those are ramps to get inside. And then you have the inner city, which is protected by another wall. So you can imagine this is a pretty intensely fortified city. And let's look at the next picture here. And this is a picture of what those walls would have been if you were close. So if you look at the bottom right, those are some soldiers. So there's a retaining wall that's holding back a bunch of dirt, and then on top of that is a brick wall, and then they have an upward climb to another brick wall. So this is a really well-defended city, right? Especially when you're thinking these guys are coming with spears, with swords, and maybe clubs and stuff. They don't have cannons, they don't have missiles or tanks. So the people of Jericho were trusting in their wall. That was their security. So let's, if we're looking at that, what would you do to try to get in? If you were Joshua and God's like, here's a first stop on your trip into the promised land, what would you do to try to get in there?
I would pray to God that He would let me know what to do.
Okay, so Zeke would ask for wisdom. Chloe, I think your hand was up. What would you try to do? Okay, so there's no planes there, though. That would work, but there's no planes. Anthony?
So if there's like a thunderstorm outside, if there's like a thunderstorm outside, that means that Mother Nature is sometimes good when there's no thunderstorm, but sometimes Mother Nature is bad.
So maybe trying to use like a storm or some kind of event to maybe get in? Did I see Micah? Did you have your hand up?
Yeah. There's like something else I can get up to the wall.
Something to get up to the wall? Landon, last one.
Grab a huge log and ram it into the rock.
Okay, ram it. So when we're looking at a big wall like this, there's really only a couple of options. Number one would maybe be going under, right? But as we saw, that is a whole lot of digging. And like if they're there and they're like throwing pebbles at you or something, like this isn't going to be very effective. The next one is going over the wall. But that's also a really big problem. That is a really high wall. Another way we can do it is to go through the wall. So that's using a battering ram. But then again, we're thinking, okay, so all the wall in front of me, right behind it, is just earth. And so that would be very tough. So over, under, through, and then possibly you just wait. So what you do is you'd lock everybody inside this city, and you'd have them wait it out until they get too hungry, and then they get too weak, and then because they don't have food. But the problem with that one is, do you remember what we talked about Jordan River? Was it small or big? It was big because it was flood season, which meant it was harvest time. So they had just got all of their crops inside. They could have waited years. So we see that the people of Israel are in a tough time. So let's read here Joshua 6, verses 1 and 2. Here's what it says. Now Jericho was tightly shut up because of the Israelites. No one went out and no one came in. Then the Lord said to Joshua, "See, I have delivered Jericho into your hands, along with its king and its fighting men." So hear this. Joshua and his people are outside the city, and we know from verse 1 that everybody is sealed up inside, because they saw what happened with the Jordan River, right? Like, they were there, and they're like, this is not going well. Let's close the gates, let's protect ourselves, and then make sure we're safe. And then God says to Joshua, "See, I've given you the city." Joshua might have been like, sure, there's a problem. Like, it's still there, right? We have no way of getting in there. What's going to happen? And like Ezekiel, you mentioned, you would ask God to help give you wisdom and show you a way. Well, God ends up giving Joshua a plan. So, for this, I'm going to need a couple of volunteers. Let's see here. Mila, I'm going to take you. All right? So we're going to have you come up first here, okay? So, Mila, your task is going to be knocking down this wall, okay? But I'm going to give you some potential tools, all right? So, I'm going to let you pick here. You've got a Louisville slugger bat. You can use that. Or you've got one of these nerf guns. Which one do you want to use you want to use the bat? All right, let's see if you can manage to make that wall fall down. All right, I would say that was pretty far down. Thank you very much. Let's give her a hand. All right, well, let's see here. Landon, I think I saw your hand. I'll let you come up here for the next one. And we're going to leave you with the nerf gun then, so you can go ahead and grab that bad boy. Now, I'm going to challenge you to not be super close, and I'm going to make sure that I don't knock this down. Okay? All right. So I want you to stand over like by that stand. See if you can, now there's 5 rounds in there. See if you can knock the whole wall down. Okay, so you're going to have to pull that back. There you go. Okay, getting closer. All right, now you just have the bottom. Oh, there's a breach.
He's in.
All right, he's got in. All right, good job. All right, so since I picked on Tom, I'm going to let you pick on somebody else. You get to choose an adult. You get to choose an adult. Yeah. So who are you picking, Tom? Teresa. Oh, Teresa. Oh, no. All right. Okay, we're going to pause that. This did not happen. We'll, excuse us for the technical difficulties. All right. All right, Teresa, you still get to come up here. Oh, look at that. Whoa! That was built in today. Here's your weapon, Teresa. You get to stand back here, and let's see you knock the wall down. Yep.
Can you use it like this?
Well, you got to stand back here, and you cannot throw it. Here you go. All right, let's see. Let's see what she's got here.
I don't think it's gonna go. Let's see the vibrations going here.
It's shuttered.
Is it?
No, I'm just kidding. Totally kidding. Yeah, give some more. Everything you got. These cups are really easy.
I think they all did it together.
All right, how long should we make her go? Should she be done? Yeah. Okay. Wow. The adults are having mercy on you. Thank you, Teresa. All right, so that's what husbands are for. So what we did is we need to recognize the people of Israel too. They had been, remember, how long were they in the wilderness for? Does anybody know how long they'd been wandering, Micah?
40 years.
For 40 years. And what happened, if you remember last year we talked about God had sent some spies into the land, and the spies came back and said, the land is great. Like, we're carrying a cluster of grapes between 2 of us on a pole. Like, it's that fertile. But there's big people there. And so Joshua and Caleb were the 2 spies who went to Canaan, And they came back and said, let's go. God has given it to us. But the 10 spies that went, remember 10 spies went to spy? Yeah. The 10 spies were like, we can't do it. And they were able to sway the whole group of Israel. And so when they did that, God said, you didn't have faith in me, so you're going to spend 40 years wandering in the wilderness, and all of the adults who did not trust me are going to pass away out there. So you have this 40 years of people wandering in the desert. Now they know at the end of this 40 years that they have the promised land they need to conquer. So if you had 40 years and you know that at the end of 40 years you're going to try to take over a whole area, what do you think you would do in those 40 years? What's that? Prepare. How would you prepare? Practice fighting? Yeah, you probably wouldn't have everybody like tanning themselves. So you have like a really, really nice bronze skin looking army, but they're all like, this spear's kind of heavy. And like, that's actually an arrow. Oh, right? So you're going to spend 40 years preparing. So the people of Israel were ready. They knew that a fight was coming. And they come up to Jericho, and as they're waiting for God's instruction, God says, bring out the praise band. And you're just like, what? And let's see what happens here. We're going to read Joshua chapter 6, starting at verse 3. So this is right after. See, I've delivered Jericho into your hands, along with its kings and its fighting men. March around the city once with all the armed men. Do this for 6 days. Have 7 priests carrying trumpets of ram's horns in front of the ark. On the 7th day, march around the city 7 times with the priests, blowing the trumpets. When you hear them sound a long blast in the trumpets, the wall of the city will collapse, and the people will go up, every single man, straight in. So Joshua, son of Nun, called the priests and said to them, take up the ark of the covenant of the Lord, and have the 7 priests carry the trumpets in front of it. And he ordered the people, advance, march around the city with the armed guard, going ahead of the ark of the Lord. When Joshua had spoken to the people, the 7 priests carrying the trumpets before the Lord went forward, blowing their trumpets, and the ark of the Lord's covenant followed them. The armed guard marched ahead of the priests who blew the trumpets, and the rear guard followed the ark. All this time the trumpets were sounding. But Joshua had commanded the people, do not give a war cry, do not raise your voices, do not say a word until the day I tell you to shout, then shout. So he had the ark of the Lord carried around the city, circling it once. Then the people returned to the camp and spent the night there. Joshua got up early the next morning, and the priests took up the ark of the Lord. The 7 priests carrying the 7 trumpets went forward, marching before the ark of the Lord, blowing the trumpets. The armed men went ahead of them, and the rear guard following the ark, while the trumpets kept sounding. So on the 2nd day, they marched around the city once and returned to the camp. They did this for 6 days. So, as we're reading this story, remember, this is an actual event that happened in history. So think what it would have been like to be this mighty army of Israel who's trained for 40 years. You are strong, you're ready to go, you're ready for a fight, you know that God is on your side, and God says, take a walk and have some people play music. And it probably isn't even music that you like. And you're sitting there stuck going around, all right? So, Zeke, you got some energy, it looks like, right? I'm going to have you walk around the sanctuary 7 times. So along the wall, along the back, 7 times. Try to avoid the cups. I don't want you to trip. All right. So, no, walking, thank you. So as he's walking, he's like, be afraid of me. Walk, normal walk. Okay? So how many of you are scared right now? Not too much? Now, granted, Zeke's not that much of a warrior, avoiding the cups, but he does have, he likes to make some weapons, right? So he's got that mindset, and he's got an itchy trigger finger. So, but we're not too scared right now. In fact, if he was like this big bully, he's like, I'm going to take you guys down. By the time I'm done with you, you're all going to be raw meat, all right? We would probably be like, how's that going for you, champ? Like, you might get a blister by the time, you're going to hurt more than we are. And so think of what it would have been like to have been one of the people in Jericho. And the mighty army of Israel comes. You saw the miracle in the Jordan River, and the first day they're coming, and you're ready to defend yourself, and they walk around the town. You're like, okay. And then the next day, you see him coming again. You're like, all right, today's the day. And they take another walk. And then by the middle of the week, you guys are like, oh, wow, guys, we're sure scared. Like, we can do this all day. And the people of Israel are just like, Joshua, why are we listening to that hosehead? I mean, come on. We can like attack this place. We got the numbers. We can do something, right? And so the people of Israel are faced with a choice. Do they follow what God has given them to do, even though it doesn't make any sense? Do they stay faithful with what God has instructed them? Or do they try to take matters into their own hand? What do you think you would do, Chloe? You want to follow God? Okay, that's a wise choice. And we see that that's what the people of Israel did. They learned their lesson from the first round going to the promised land, okay? And so they keep on going on. Now here's another point to this. Sometimes God calls us to do things, and it might not make any sense. Okay? Like, why did I ask Zeke to walk around when he likes those cuffs so much? And sometimes we don't see anything happening, but God says, I want you to still do it. In our world today, the message we get is quit. It's not worth it. Just give up. Was that 7 times?
Yep.
All right.
Daddy?
Yes.
Who's going to shoot the wall?
Nope. I know, bummer. But anyways, so the message we get from our world is that if you don't see results right away, just give up, you know? But God is calling us to be faithful even when it's hard, even when we don't see anything. And there's so many different areas of life that this applies to. In school, I'm sure that when you guys think about all the things that God tells you to do, and you see your classmates not doing any of that, that can be frustrating. You're like, God, why would I keep doing this? It just makes things hard. And God's calling you to be faithful, to keep going, even though you don't see anything happening, and trust that He is working. Because as we see here, even though we don't see results, when we act in faith, God works. So let's see what happened. Verse 15, on the 7th day, they got up at daybreak and marched around the city 7 times, in the same manner, except that on that day they circled the city 7 times. The 7th time around, when the priest sounded the trumpet blast, Joshua commanded the people, shout, for the Lord was given you the city. And then verse 20. When the trumpet sounded, the people shouted at the sound of the trumpet. And when the people gave a loud shout, the wall collapsed. So every man charged straight in, and they took the city. So all those times walking around, nothing happened. And I wonder if the 6th time around on that 7th day, they were still kind of struggling, like, this doesn't make any sense. The 7th time around, and Joshua says, all right, yell! And they're like, yay! You know, or if they put their hearts into it because they trusted in the Lord. But we see that they walked 7 times, they obeyed, they shouted, and the wall did what it wasn't supposed to do. It fell. And the people were able to march right in. So, to celebrate this, we're going to sing a song. And the song is about Joshua and Jericho and the battle. So, let's stand up. Okay, so the word should be up, beautiful, on the screen. You guys are on the ball back there. I love it. So the tune is, Joshua fought the battle of Jericho, Jericho, Jericho. Joshua fought the battle of Jericho, and the walls came a-tumbling down. So that's the chorus. And then the verses, you may talk about your man of Gideon, you may talk about the man of Saul, but there's none like good old Joshua at the battle of Jericho. And the words will change, but that's how the tune goes, all right? So here we are. Joshua fought the battle of Jericho, Jericho, Jericho. Joshua fought the battle of Jericho, and the walls came a-tumbling down. You may talk about your man of Gideon, you may talk about the man of Saul, but there's none like good old Joshua and the battle of Jericho. Joshua fought the battle of Jericho, Jericho, Jericho. Joshua fought the battle of Jericho, and the walls came a-tumbling down. Up to the walls of Jericho they marched with spears and swords. Come blow them ram horns, Joshua said, 'cause the battle is the Lord's. Joshua fought the battle of Jericho, Jericho, Jericho. Joshua fought the battle of Jericho, and the walls came a-tumbling down. Then the priests on the ram's horn start to blow, the trumpets they did sound. Joshua told them, people, shout, and the walls came a-tumbling down. Joshua fought the battle of Jericho, Jericho, Jericho. Joshua fought the battle of Jericho, and the walls came a-tumbling down. Well, Jesus is our Joshua, we put our trust in him. He endured the cross and rose again, and he tumbled down our sin. Just like Joshua fought the battle of Jericho, Jericho, Jericho. Joshua fought the battle of Jericho, and the walls came a-tumbling down. Joshua fought the battle of Jericho, Jericho, Jericho. Joshua fought the battle of Jericho, and the walls came a-tumbling down. And the walls came a-tumbling down. All right. Go ahead and have a seat again. Good job singing, everybody. Now, last week, do you guys remember who was the different person that we talked about? It wasn't Joshua, but it was somebody who lived in the city. Zeke? Rahab. It was Rahab, right? So we talked a little bit about Rahab, and we just really glazed over the story of Rahab. But here's where Rahab comes back into the story, okay? So we're going to pick up in Joshua chapter 6, reading verses 17 through 19. And let's be honest, there's some things that we're going to read about that are kind of tough. So we're going to spend some time on that too. Verse 17, the city and all that is in it, this is God talking to Joshua again, are to be devoted to the Lord. Only Rahab the prostitute and all who are with her in her house shall be spared, because she hid the spies we sent. But keep away from the devoted things, so that you will not bring about your own destruction by taking any of them. Otherwise, you will make the camp of Israel liable to destruction and bring trouble in it. All the silver and gold and articles of bronze and iron are sacred to the Lord and must go into his treasury. So forgive me, I don't think that was God. That was Joshua who was commanding this. But Joshua's instructions came from the Lord. So the difficult thing that we need to deal with here is a question of, is God good? We believe that God is good, right? But did we hear what God commanded his people to do? What did he tell them to do? Who from the city of Jericho was supposed to live? Rahab and her family, those who are with Rahab. What does that mean for everybody else? They would die. So that means that if we were living in Jericho and Joshua was coming up the drive here, and let's say the parsonage was Rahab's house, let's not make that connection too closely because that's kind of weird. But let's say that for all of us then, we would be killed. Right? And I'm looking at us, and we got some fighting age men here. We have a couple people who could be like, lift a sword, gird their loins, right? We've got some younger kids who wouldn't have been involved in that. We'd consider them innocent. And I'm looking at little baby Azaliah. And so this is a difficult thing for us to wrestle with. God being good, but also telling his people, you go into this land and you are to destroy everyone except those who are in Rahab's house. And here's, guys, where we get back to God's character, who God is. God is perfect. And God is so perfect that he is so perfect we don't understand his perfection. And a part of his perfection is that that's all that he can stand in his presence. So I used to talk about it like this. How many of you have been in a dark, kind of dingy room? And like there's shadows everywhere, right? And it's not very well lit. And you don't really know what's behind that corner because you can't really see it. That's kind of our view of justice and right and wrong. We see like these shades, there's darkness because we have sin in our life. But when you flip on that like uber bright light and every shadow goes away, where is the darkness in that room? It's gone. Because darkness can't exist in the presence of light. And that's like our sin with the presence of God's holiness. They can't exist together. So the problem that you have, that I have, that everybody in this world has, is that we have that darkness of sin inside of us. And because we have that darkness of sin, the thing that we deserve, like Pastor said this morning, it's a good thing we don't get what we deserve, because we deserve God's punishment, each one of us. And people in our world don't like that. They don't agree with it because we have a messed up understanding of what justice is. Again, we're in that dark room seeing these darkness and we're like, I'm lighter than that, so I should be okay. But God's saying even the brightest dingy light is dark compared to my presence. All right? And so when we look at the people of Canaan, they were getting the judgment that they deserved. And sometimes it's really hard for us to understand, but that's what's happening here. Another thing that we want to talk about is happening later, verses 21 to 27. Let's hear what it says here. So the people of Israel, they devoted the city to the Lord, and they destroyed it with the sword, every living thing in it, men and women, young and old, cattle, sheep, and donkeys. Joshua said to the two men who had spied out the land, "Go into the prostitute's house and bring her out and all who belong to her in accordance with your oath to her." So the young men who had done the spying went in and brought out Rahab, her father and mother and brothers, and all who belonged to her. They brought out their entire family and put them in a place outside the camp of Israel. Then they burned the whole city and everything in it. But they put the silver and gold and articles of bronze and iron into the treasury of the Lord's house. But Joshua spared Rahab the prostitute with her family and all who belonged to her, because she hid them. Men Joshua sent the spies to Jericho, and she lives among the Israelites to this day. At that time Joshua pronounced a solemn oath, "Cursed before the Lord is the man who undertakes to rebuild the city, Jericho. At the cost of his firstborn son will he lay its foundations. At the cost of his youngest will he set up its gates." So with the Lord was with Joshua, and his fame spread throughout the land. Okay, so some very important stuff. What happened to Rahab? Was she spared? Okay, now I know that last week I had a conversation with the young man in my house. There's only one, so it's kind of limiting the odds here, but he asked me what that P word was. And I don't know if anybody else had conversations about that, but that's an important part of the story. Because what Rahab was as a prostitute is something that people would look down on and say, that's dirty, that's wrong, that's immoral. All right? And that's what she did. But notice what happens in this story. That despite everything coming crashing down, which is actually really interesting historically, because they've done some digging and they found the site of Jericho, and there was one small section in the north side, I believe it was, of the city where a wall section remained. And remember, Rahab's house was built into the wall, because that's how the spies were able to escape, on this lower wall. And so we see, even historically, like evidence of this stuff happening. But that's beside the point. The main thing is, Rahab was spared because she trusted in God. And what's so important for us is, maybe this morning, when I was talking about the darkness and the light, you might be thinking to yourself, I understand that. I've got a lot of that darkness in me. I feel that. I want you to hear this, that even the person with the most darkness in their heart is not beyond being saved by God. Rahab shows us that God came to save not just a certain people, but anybody who was willing to be saved. And so may we get comfort from that fact of Rahab, that nobody here has done something so bad that you cannot be forgiven. Nobody here has done something so wrong that Jesus hasn't paid for that sin. It's available for you. And if you will have any questions about that, I want you to talk to your parents or talk to me. That's so important that you guys hear that invitation from Jesus. The next thing, too, that we see is that God is faithful. What God had said he would do, he did. He brought it about just like he said, and he delivered into his people's hand the land of Canaan. All right, let's pray. Father, I thank you for this truth. God, that we're ending on here, that just as we sang in the Battle of Jericho, Jesus, you are the one who has fought that battle of sin for us. And Lord, we don't have anything that can attack that fortified problem of sin in our life. Just like the people of Israel, when they're faced with that wall, they couldn't go under it, they couldn't go over it, they couldn't go through it, they couldn't really wait them out. And God, you provided a way. Just so, Father, you have provided a way for us to get through the problem of sin, which was Jesus. And God, you offer that to each one of us. Help us to see that this story in the Old Testament, God, is pointing to you and delivering us and fulfilling your promises. And I pray that each one of us would know that truth. God, we also pray that we'd understand the severity of sin. And even beyond that, God, the goodness and the faithfulness of you. No matter what we might think of how impossible some promise that you've given us is, to walk in faith and obedience. And God, just encourage our hearts as we know you more. And Lord, may that knowledge of you lead to an overwhelming love for you too. I pray for each of these students here and the parents as well, and those who are taking care of them. Bless us all, Jesus, as we go on this week. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. It's all done. Thanks for coming, guys. And if anybody is interested in maybe more for the adults, I do have a little printout talking about Jericho and some of the archaeological discoveries of it too. So I found it pretty interesting. If you want to take a look, it's up here. I can get it to you later too.